Good evening. My name's Tom Cadigan, Associate Director of Alumni Relations, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Alumni Education live web lecture entitled The Electoral College and the 2012 Presidential Election, a timely topic with our national elections just a little over 1 month away. Tonight's lecture, for all Holy Cross alumni, parents, and friends, will be presented by Professor Donald Brand of the Political Science Department here at Holy Cross and also chair of that department. Don holds a Ph.D. from the University of Chicago and is a renowned scholar in presidential politics and American national institutions. And we're grateful that he's offering his time for us tonight. And I encourage all of you at home to participate in tonight's presentation by sending us any comments or questions that you may have throughout tonight's presentation. You can do so by clicking on the chat button located on the screen in front of you, or you can send us your comments or questions by Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter. And we encourage you to follow along, and we look forward to a great presentation. Tonight's discussion will be about 20 minutes long, and at the end of that, Don will field as many questions as time allows. So again, thank you for joining us, and now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Donald Brand.
Welcome to the electronic classroom. This is my first webinar. It's a little unusual to be speaking to an audience I can't see, but we all have to change with developing technology, and I don't want to be a dinosaur. So I want to talk about the Electoral College and the way it's structuring the 2012 election. The Electoral College is really a quite fascinating institution. It derives from the Constitutional Convention. At the Constitutional Convention, the American framers were trying to select a mode for choosing the President of the United States, and they were torn between two methods, neither of which was satisfactory. The first method was direct popular election of the President. Some very prominent members of the Constitutional Convention were interested in this mode of appointment, including James Madison and James Wilson. But there were insuperable obstacles to embracing direct popular election, as even Madison had to acknowledge. For one thing, we were divided between small states and large states. This is a familiar division that influenced the creation of the American Congress, led to the creation of a Senate where states were equally represented, and the House where representation was based on population. But it also affected questions about presidential election. The small states feared that a direct popular election of the president would lead to presidential candidates simply ignoring their interest and appealing to the big states only, like Pennsylvania and Virginia. In addition, the South was concerned about the impact of presidential election. The issue of slavery. Slavery affected a great deal of the Constitutional Convention. Slaves would not vote. The Southerners feared that an election, a direct popular election, would lead to a predominance of the North over the South, and they were therefore very reluctant to see that mode of selection chosen. Finally, I think all statesmen at the Constitutional Convention were fearful that people were rather parochial, that they tended to know who the best political figures were to be able to evaluate candidates within the boundaries of their own state. But generally, they were not well informed about the potential statesman-like qualities of figures from other states, other than George Washington, who was unambiguously the preeminent national figure of his day. So with those objections to direct popular election in mind, the Constitutional Convention turned to an alternative method, which was legislative selection. That is, the U.S. Congress would select, or particularly the House of Representatives, would select the president. But here again, there were deep and profound objections to that mode of selection. That is, by the way, the mode of selection that many parliamentary systems, or parliamentary systems in general, use today. The basic objection was that they wanted a president who could stand up to Congress when Congress acted either in a manner harmful to the best interests of the country or perhaps in a manner inimical to the rights of individuals. We believed in a system, almost all Americans believed, in the principle of separation of powers. If Congress were to select the president, there was a great fear that the president would kowtow to Congress. So They went back and forth with the obstacles to both of these selections, and finally a committee of 11 was appointed, and they re-examined this question and came up with the Electoral College, which actually was an extraordinarily clever way of finessing some of these issues. The Electoral College would work in the following manner. Each state would have presidential electors, one for each member of the House and two for the two senators who represented that state. The minimum number of representatives you could have were 3. This assuaged the concerns of the small states. It boosted the small states' representation over what they would have had under direct popular election. It also finessed the issue of slavery for the South, because the number of representatives in the House of Representatives that each state had was determined by summing the number of essentially white citizens and then 3/5 of all black slaves in that state. That is, southern states got a boost in the House for their slave populations, which would then in turn carry over to the House of Representatives. Finally, electors were thought of as some of the most esteemed members of their state who would exercise discretion, who would be more knowledgeable about who the most prominent figures from other states might be. So electors were a way of elevating the election process above the parochialism of perhaps direct popular election. The Electoral College carried the day, and it is perhaps a lesson in humility that the Founding Fathers, in my view, one of the greatest collection of statesmen ever to gather for any political purpose in world history, took great pride in this institution, the Electoral College, and yet almost immediately it did not work the way they intended it to work. For one thing, they had hoped to avoid the bane of political parties. Yet, no sooner was the American Republic launched than Americans began to divide along partisan lines. And once the logic of party competition intersected with the logic of the Electoral College, everything began to go amok, essentially. In 1796, John Adams was elected president, and Thomas Jefferson, his great political rival, was elected vice president. The Electoral College had not precluded the possibility that a president of one party and a vice president of another party would be elected. In 1800, the Electoral College deadlocked, and it took a lengthy session of the House of Representatives, or of Congress, to eventually resolve questions of presidential selection, which led to the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, altering the Electoral College. I won't go into all the details here. Perhaps we can get into them in a question and answer session if they are of interest to you. But in any case, the Electoral College continued to evolve over the next 30 years in ways that I think were fundamentally unanticipated by the American framers. For one thing, states began to embrace something called the winner-take-all rule. Now, many of you, I think, will be familiar with the winner-take-all rule. That is, when we have a national election for president, if one candidate wins 49% of the vote and another candidate wins 51% of the vote, the 51% candidate gets all of the Electoral College's votes from that state. They are not allocated proportionately based on the popular vote. Now Americans are familiar with this, but what they often don't realize is that this rule is nowhere written into the Constitution. It is in fact a law, it is in fact built into separate state laws and state constitutions, and it evolved throughout the early part of the 19th century and has prevailed ever since then. It profoundly shapes the way the Electoral College works. But again, it actually does not have constitutional status as a rule. Today, all states but 2 rely on the winner-take-all system, and I do want to point out that there are 2 exceptions. They're interesting exceptions, and some of them will help you to understand some of the dynamics of the 2012 election. Maine and Nebraska have a different system for allocating presidential electors. Maine and Nebraska have what's often referred to as the congressional district system, where each congressional district elects one elector who is pledged to vote as the constituents in that electoral district voted. And then the 2 electors in the Electoral College that are based on senatorial representation will go for the winner, or the plurality winner more precisely, in the popular vote statewide. What that means is that it is possible for Maine and Nebraska to split their Electoral College votes, unlike winner-take-all states, which always allocate their votes en bloc. Maine and Nebraska Maine has had this system since 1976, or 1972 rather. Nebraska has had it since 1996. Interestingly enough, in only one election thus far have the electors from one of these states ever been split. And that turns out to have been Nebraska in 2008. Nebraska has 5 electors. It has 3 members in the House of Representatives and 2 senators, so 5 electors. 4 of those electors went to John McCain, but 1 of those electors went to Barack Obama because he won a congressional district near the city of Omaha. That little fact actually gets some attention as we turn to the 2012 election. So let me do that now. Let me turn to the 2012 election and talk a little bit about the way the Electoral College is shaping the process. What the Electoral College does is it federalizes an election. And what I mean by that is that the winner of the presidential election will be determined not just by how many votes they get, but by where those votes are located. You can pile up certain kinds of votes in a way that are not really going to increase your strength in the Electoral College, or you can fail to get votes in areas where it would be absolutely critical to get those votes if you hope to prevail in the Electoral College. Now, when we talk about the Electoral College in the context of contemporary elections, the way in which it federalizes the election creates the following basic dynamics. There are some states that are firmly in the base of each candidate. There's not much electoral competition going on there. And there are a handful of states, and it varies from election to election, and it even varies within a single election. The number of battleground states will generally tend to winnow down and get narrower as we proceed closer to the election itself. But these battleground states are where the election is really being fought out. They're where candidates allocate their money, where the campaign stops are being programmed at. Those of us who are not in a battleground state don't get nearly as much attention. Those of us, for instance, in Massachusetts don't get much attention because there's no question that President Obama will win the Electoral College votes of Massachusetts, even though Governor Romney is a former governor from the state. Massachusetts is too emphatically Democratic a state to really be electorally competitive. So let's, to see where we are in 2012, I want to first begin by going back just a little bit and looking first at 2008. So hopefully this map will be visible to people. And this map, now you notice in this map in 2008, there are no battleground states, of course, because the battles have already been fought and the states either went Republican or Democratic, blue, Democratic, red, Republican. And as you can see from the top figure up there, it was a decisive victory, at least in the Electoral College, for President Obama. He got 365 Electoral College votes versus 173 for John McCain. Now, if we were to go back, and one thing I would like to state about this, this was a sweeping victory for President Obama. That is, he was able in this election to capture states that traditionally have gone Republican. So, in a way, that fact defines the dynamic of this campaign. That is, the dynamic of this campaign is President Obama is playing defense and Mitt Romney is playing offense. Now, that may sound like a strange way to characterize it, given the fact that right now President Obama seems to be ahead in the polls, particularly in some of the battleground states. But the simple truth is, all President Obama would have to do is hold on to the states that he won in 2008. In fact, he could even afford to lose some of them, and he could still win the election. if you look at the states that John McCain won, there is, with the possible exception of Missouri, and even that I think is a very questionable possibility, a virtual certainty that Mitt Romney is going to win every state John McCain won. In terms of the dynamics of the electoral process, although McCain came reasonably close in the popular vote, the Republican strength receded in the 2008 election, and so these you could think of as the most solidly Republican of states. If they went for McCain in 2008, they will almost certainly go for Romney in 2012. On the other hand, if we were to go jump to the 2004 election, now in the 2004 election, George W. Bush won re-election, not anywhere near as decisively as Barack Obama won in 2008, but still, Bush had actually expanded upon his electoral victory in 2000, and you'll notice. So this would represent a map where if Republicans sort of maximize their electoral strength and were reasonably successful, these are the places where Republicans could hope to win that they didn't win in 2008. For instance, I'm pointing to states like Virginia, North Carolina, Florida. These states were all won by Bush in 2004, but they were lost by McCain in 2008. Even Indiana, one of a state that is very traditionally Republican, went by the most narrow of margins to Obama in 2008, but was, as you can see, a Republican state in 2004. So this gives you if you compare the 2008 and the 2004 maps, you can see where Republicans would hope to make up some of the ground that they lost in 2008. By the way, all these maps come from a website called realclearpolitics.com, which is an extremely useful website for those of you who are interested in following electoral matters. By the way, not just presidential election, Senate races, House races. They they have a whole sequence of Electoral College maps that you can pull up to see historically what different elections look like. Now, let me jump ahead and let's talk about 2012 and where things stand right now. The Electoral College maps tend to be divided in the following way. The deep red states are strongly in the Republican column, strongly Romney states. There are the pinkish color, which hopefully you can see, like Arizona, is considered leaning Republican. Then you have the deep blue states, which are strong Democratic states, and the light blue states, like Oregon, Wisconsin, Michigan, are leaning Obama. One of the critical ones to note right now, by the way, and this is based on the most recent polling, is that Ohio, which many Republicans consider to be a critical state to win, has now moved into the lean Obama category. In fact, if you were to sum up the Electoral College votes of states that are strongly in Obama's column and states that are leaning Obama today, if we assume that maybe the presidential election were going to be held tomorrow, and we put those states in the Obama category, Obama would get 269 Electoral College votes. 270 is the magic number for winning in the Electoral College. So Obama is very close to victory. That's if the election, however, were held tomorrow. And but the election, of course, won't be held tomorrow. We still have quite a few days, and a lot can happen. And so, the states where where most of the action is occurring are the brown states: Virginia, North Carolina, Florida. Missouri is listed in that way. Iowa, Colorado, Nevada. These are the battleground states where, as I say, most of the money is being spent, where the candidates are spending vastly disproportionate amounts of time. Now let me point out to you a very interesting hypothetical scenario. This is, and this is strictly hypothetical, I think in fact very unlikely, but nevertheless fascinating to consider. If you were to sum up the number of seats that Romney has as the combination of lean Republican and solidly Republican, you get 181 seats. If Romney were actually able to run the gamut, suppose there were a shift in support right now. Right now, President Obama is looking pretty strong. But suppose, based on debate performance or something like that, the dynamics were to shift. And Romney came on strong enough to capture all of the battleground states, every one of them. Now again, this is a purely hypothetical scenario, but not strong enough to turn any of the light blue states in his favor. He simply captured all of the battleground states. So he captures Florida, North Carolina, Virginia, Missouri, Iowa, Colorado, Nevada. Well, I just mentioned to you that President Obama has 269 Electoral College votes, if you count lean Obama, strong Obama. If Romney captured all the battlegrounds, Romney would end up with 269 Electoral College votes. Also, there are 538 Electoral College votes altogether. That's adding up 435 members of the House of Representatives, 100 senators is 535, and then the District of Columbia, which by the 23rd Constitutional Amendment got 3 Electoral College votes. Altogether, 538, divide 538 by 2, and you get 269. 538 is an even number. It would be possible for the Electoral College to evenly split. And while the scenarios by which that could happen, you might consider remote, they're not unthinkable, and there are political strategists out there who are very much thinking about that possibility. So let me first just indicate that we do have in the Constitution a backup plan, but most of you are probably not that familiar with it because it hasn't been used since 1824. In fact, it's only been used twice in American political history, once in 1800. I mentioned earlier the first election of Thomas Jefferson ended up in the House of Representatives. And in 1824, John Quincy Adams prevailed over Andrew Jackson in an election that went into the House of Representatives. So if the admittedly remote possibility were to occur, this election could end up in the House of Representatives. And I just want to let you know exactly how that scenario would pan out, however remote it might be. In the House of Representatives, the fallback mechanism in the Constitution is that each state gets 1 vote. So that means California, with its vast population, has the same voting power as Delaware or Rhode Island or Wyoming. How do these states arrive at their vote? They poll their internal congressional caucus, the caucus for that particular state, and it's essentially plurality prevails. That is, if there are more votes for Romney in the congressional delegation than there are for Obama. Say there were here in Massachusetts there are 9 representatives. If 5 voted for Romney and 4, if 5 voted for Obama and 4 voted for Romney, Obama would carry the 1 vote of the state of Massachusetts. Right now, if you look at the congressional delegations and the way Congress is structured, if the election is thrown into the House of Representatives, Romney almost certainly wins. Republicans control 33 state delegations. Now, mind you, the House that would determine this scenario is the new House that would be elected in the 2012 election. So admittedly, it could change by comparison with the House that we have right now, but the expectations are not that the Democrats could elect so many members that it would alter the dynamics that I'm talking about right now. Again, I just throw that out as a kind of interesting hypothetical scenario. Now, I do want to run through for you an explanation for how it is that the Electoral College can sometimes produce a winner that does not conform to the winner of the popular vote. Many of you are aware that in the 2000 election, Al Gore actually got about 500,000 more popular votes than George W. Bush was able to get. So how is it that the Electoral College can produce this? Now, mind you, this is a rare phenomena. Scholars debate to some degree exactly how many elections this has happened in. I lean to the conclusion that it really has only happened twice in American history, in 1888 and in 2000. There are two other elections that are in dispute, 1876 and 1824. But in 1876, there was so much corruption in that election, I'm not sure people really know who won the popular vote. In 1824, not all states even had popular elections, so it's difficult to categorize it as a clear-cut example. So how is this possible? How can somebody win the popular vote and yet not win in the Electoral College? Well, I have a simplified state model here for you. In my simplified state model, State A has 1 million people in it. And districts in the House, to make this very simple so it is conceptually clear, 1 million people entitle you to a single representative in the House of Representatives. So State A has 1 representative in the House and 2 senators. Therefore, it gets 3 presidential electors. In State B, we have 10 million people in the state. Again, House representation, 1 million per representative. So State B, because it has 10 million people, get 10 representatives, 2 senators, 12 presidential electors altogether. Hopefully this is visible on the screen. Now we go to my hypothetical scenario, my hypothetical election. State A is overwhelmingly Republican. Romney gets all 1 million votes. I get to make this up. It's hypothetical, so I'm going to accentuate for the sake of clarity here. Romney gets 1 million votes. In State B, it's a highly competitive state. Obama ekes out a victory by getting 5,000,001 votes to Romney's 4,999,000. A closer election is not feasible, all right? But now, and some of you can probably already see where this is going, let's think about the contrast between the Electoral College outcome under this situation and the popular vote. Obama altogether got 5,000,001 votes. He didn't get any votes in State A. All his votes came from State B. Romney, summing across the 2 states, got 5,990,999 votes. Romney is the clear winner in the popular votes. But because in the Electoral College we aggregate on a state-by-state basis, Obama had the razor-thin majority in State B, but that's all it takes. He got all 12 Electoral College votes. Romney got only 3 Electoral College votes. Now, this is a much simplified model, but I think it does illustrate to you what goes on in the Electoral College. That is, the Electoral College can produce a non-majority winner in the popular vote because of the manner or mechanism they use for aggregating votes. It is not because electors are somehow ignoring the will of the people. It is that we are summing votes state by state. Now that leads to all sorts of interesting debates, and maybe we can get into this in the question and answer period about whether or not we should be keeping the Electoral College. I'm actually a defender of the Electoral College, but it's because I think it does have some significant merits. But I'm just going to leave it on this following note. There is one other problem with the Electoral College, and I just don't want you to conflate this other problem with what I'm talking about right here. The other problem is what we call the problem of the faithless elector. It is perhaps impossible constitutionally to bind electors to make them vote as the popular vote went in their state. Remember, in the original design of the Electoral College, when the framers were setting it up, electors were meant to exercise discretion. We have evolved towards a system where electors are simply supposed to automatically reflect the popular vote in their state. But constitutionally, they are still entitled to discretion. You can make them pledge, but it's not clear we could absolutely bind them to vote as their state votes. There have been a handful of faithless electors throughout American political history, but no faithless elector has ever changed the outcome of an election. One of the last faithless electors was in the 2000 election, when one of the electors from the District of Columbia refused to vote for Al Gore, not because she wouldn't have preferred Gore to Bush, but because she wanted to protest the fact that the District of Columbia does not have representation in the House or in the Senate. It did not affect the outcome of that election, and she knew that when she cast her spoiled ballot. The problem of the faithless elector is not trivial, but on the other hand, again, I emphasize it's never influenced the outcome of any election in American political history. The important thing to keep in mind is that faithless electors are therefore not responsible for things like the 2000 election, where Bush wins in the Electoral College, despite the fact that he did not win a popular vote. So I think I'll leave it at that for now, and I want to entertain your questions, and so feel free to All right, how do you feel about the role of third-party candidates in progressing the national dialogue and discourse? That's a great question, and in a way, it takes us right into this debate about whether or not we should continue to have the Electoral College. There have been a great many amendments over time suggested, none have gotten that far, to abolish the Electoral College and perhaps replace it with some form of direct popular election of the president. One of the arguments for not doing that is that the Electoral College tends to reinforce the two-party system. So as a defender of the Electoral College, I also am a defender of the two-party system. I would argue that under most circumstances, big tent parties build broad coalitions which moderate the demands of the various groups that become parts of that big tent, and therefore the elections tend to converge on a kind of, they moderate the potential campaign pledges of various candidates. The Electoral College reinforces the two-party system, and if you want an example of that, think about the 1992 election. Recall that in 1992, George Herbert Walker Bush was running for re-election against Bill Clinton when Ross Perot decided that neither of the political parties was really seriously addressing the problem of debt. And so he entered as a third-party candidate. And the reason it's an interesting election, Ross Perot got 19% of the popular vote. That's the best third-party performance since Teddy Roosevelt ran in 1912. Yet Ross Perot did not get a single Electoral College vote. His votes were dispersed throughout the country, and to win an Electoral College vote, you must be the plurality winner in a state. By a plurality winner, I mean the person who gets the most votes. So you don't actually have to get a majority, but if the vote is divided three ways, you need to be the highest vote getter among the three to get Electoral College votes. Ross Perot didn't achieve that. In every state, either Bill Clinton or George Herbert Walker Bush got more votes than Ross Perot, and therefore Ross Perot was shut out of the Electoral College. I think that had a tendency to marginalize the influence of Ross Perot's party. And what happened is Ross Perot, the very real concerns represented by Ross Perot and his voters, I think got taken up and channeled and again moderated by the two major political parties. So I'm not a fan. I would not like to see the American political system evolve in the direction of three, or by the way, Why just 3? Why not 4 or 5? I think that would fragment the American polity in ways that would make it more difficult to govern. Does winner take all and the Electoral College promote party polarization by labeling states as all blue and all red? I think there may be some tendency to do that, although I think it's then incumbent on political commentators to point out that states have, even red states have pockets of blue support, and we often see in an analysis of an election it broken down on a county-by-county basis rather than simply on a state basis. But there's no question that it does tend to say that a state like Texas, for instance, does portray a state like Texas as being sort of emphatically in the red column, and a state like California being emphatically in the blue column. And if you do look at those states, they have minorities that certainly don't fit into that description. So that's a good question. Is there a tiebreaker for the House? 25 states each vote for a candidate. Well, in the House of Representatives, what happens is that you must win by a majority of the states. So the figure of 25 is exactly accurate. You have to, there are going to be 50 votes since there are 50 states. By the way, if it goes into the House, the District of Columbia doesn't get to participate in the process. So you have to get a majority of the states. So actually you'd have to get 26 states to constitute a majority of the House. What happens if you don't get there? Answer, you take another ballot. In fact, in 1800, I believe they did not finally legitimate the election of Thomas Jefferson until the 36th ballot. So the House essentially goes into continuous session, and you get repeated ballots where there's a great deal of attempt at persuasion of people until you get to the threshold. If the House does not come up with a president, then the fallback mechanism for the vice president is election in the Senate. And in the Senate, by the way, senators vote one by one. They don't vote en bloc as states. So, which raises, by the way, the following very interesting hypothetical scenario. If my 269 to 269 hypothetical scenario, Obama-Romney tie, and it goes into the House, then the House will select the next President of the United States, and the Senate will select the next Vice President of the United States. Since currently Democrats control the Senate, unless they were to lose control in the 2012 elections, it is possible that coming out of the 2012 election, we would have President Romney and Vice President Biden. That would be not exactly a prospect for a harmonious administration. On the other hand, the likelihood is that the vice president would be so marginalized in such a scenario. But in any case, if the House couldn't get to the 26th threshold, then if the Senate elected Biden, Biden would become president until the House resolved its conflict. So let's see. Can you comment on the rumored oversampling of Democrats, particularly in Ohio, and how this would affect the electoral predictions? Yeah, there's a lot of controversy about this question. Polls are statistical samples, so they sampled just a few people, and from that small number of people, they try to infer how larger bodies of people are going to act. And there's a great deal, there are judgment calls that go in to these kinds of samplings. One of the most important judgment calls is, what's the likely turnout of particular demographic groups? So that, for instance, African Americans who voted overwhelmingly for President Obama in 2008 not only voted overwhelmingly for President Obama, but they turned out in record numbers. Roughly 13% of the vote was African American. If one accepts the premise that people are not do not feel as euphoric about President Obama, that there's some disillusionment with him, which need not be sufficient to convince, for instance, significant number of African Americans to vote for Romney, which would be a rather radical change of course. But if there were sufficient disillusionment that African Americans did not turn out to the polls in the record numbers they turned out in 2008. After all, this is no longer the first election of an African American. Suppose African Americans voted at about, they made up about 11% of the national electorate, which has been more typical for elections prior to 2008. If you assume that, then Romney is doing better in some of these polls than is indicated, because some of the pollsters seem to be factoring in 2008-like predictions regarding turnout and enthusiasm for candidates. Or more precisely, probably many of them are doing something of a mix between 2004 and 2008, but arguably this election will be closer to 2004 in terms of turnout than it will be to 2008. So that's a great question. All right. Who will I be voting for in November? That one I think I'm going to decline to answer. Let me assure you, I'm teaching a course in presidential selection this semester, actually teaching 2 sections of it. And though I do have a partisan identity, I always believe it is incumbent on me as a professor when I'm teaching classes, and this is an electronic version of a class, I try to be as nonpartisan as I can. I feel it's my responsibility to encourage students to think for themselves, and I don't want to try to get on a partisan platform and use the lectern as a chance to advance a partisan agenda. So I'll have to decline to answer that one.
Well, many thanks to Professor Brand for sharing his time and his knowledge with us tonight. And I encourage all of you to continue tonight's discussion by visiting the Holy Cross Alumni Facebook page. Just search Holy Cross Alumni and follow the on-screen instructions. Again, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and have a great evening. Take care.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
Oh, sure. Very much. Yeah.